because the worst thing is when you don't have the solar power to keep your freezer going, and then you have all this food that you need to take care of. And it can be super devastating when you have a freezer go out full of food and you have no idea how you're going to preserve it. Hello fellow homesteaders, let's talk about how we preserve our food here at the Oasis Farms Homestead. Whether growing abundance in the garden, hunting, raising livestock, we all have to learn how to package, preserve, and store our great bounties. And depending on individual situations, there's lots of ways to keep our foods eatable. Through our homesteading journey, I did a lot of experimenting with how to store and preserve food. Some of it out of necessity, needing to learn how to do it, when to do it, and creating the environments best to do it in. And depending on the situation, I'd have little bits to take care of, or one of those situations where you get a whole bunch of something and you just have no idea what to do with it and you got to figure out something to do with it. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of go through our food storage learning curve and buildup and all the things that I kind of had to do to keep our food from spoiling. So in Montana, in the very beginning, we started out in a tent. We had a cooler and that was it. So when I went grocery shopping, I really had to pay attention to what I was getting, meal plans, what I need to cook right when I get home, and making sure that everything we get gets eaten or used up or something before I either go to town again to get more ice or I go to town again to get more ice and more groceries, kind of having to figure out that sort of balance. So we did the cooler method system of going to town and getting ice, and we would take the cooler with us and right out of the grocery store pack the ice and pack the food before we had to drive home. But we did that method for a really long time before we got the freezer. Seriously, the best thing ever. Super huge upgrade. It eliminated a whole lot of work and thinking and planning when it came to grocery shopping. It also made our harvests easier to deal with than just having a cooler. But before we get on to kind of the freezer aspect, with the cooler, I'll definitely say that if you are kind of in the cooler kind of situation, reusable bags for grocery shopping is a super big help. You get to sort things a little better before you have to bring it home, as well as things like the reusable vegetable bags, plastic food totes and containers for storage of leftovers, your cheeses and all that stuff is super helpful because it's in its own little container. And I find that just like in a fridge, it's very helpful to keep things fresh. Doing this cooler method is kind of the hardest thing to try and do, keeping your food from spoiling. So like I said, the freezer was a huge upgrade. We freeze water bottles to just put into the cooler, so we now have more of a freezer, cooler, fridge kind of situation, which works really well for us. It is really tedious, especially when it's really hot, like here in Arizona, having to constantly check the water bottles in here and make sure they're not warm or all the way thawed out, making sure I'm always putting cold frozen water bottles from the freezer into the cooler. Sometimes it was 3 times a day at the hottest times here in Arizona, but now that it's cool enough, it's kind of once, maybe twice a day. And the reason it took so long in the beginning, sort of middle of things, to get the freezer was because we were building up our solar system. And it just took us a while to build up enough to be able to sustain a freezer. The worst thing is when you don't have the solar power to keep your freezer going, and then you have all this food that you need to take care of. And it can be super devastating when you have a freezer go out full of food and you have no idea how you're going to preserve it. So that's where a lot of my aspects of food preservation came in, was not only to learn to deal with the cooler aspect of things, but also like, what if I don't have my freezer available? Whether it breaks and I can't fix it, the solar goes out, the world ends, whatever it is, I want to know how to preserve my food in all the ways possible. So of course the biggest thing is storage, and where do I put all this food? I do my best that we don't have too much food, but we are kind of a prepper mentality and we like to have backstock. But it's hard to have backstock when you don't really have the storage space for it. So through a lot of my experimenting, I have figured out what works, what doesn't, what goes bad here, then, or there. And I found out you do not really need to refrigerate the majority of your condiments. I know some of you are probably like, but I've never had a condiment go bad sitting in the totes. And that's been from the tent days, and that was like 8 years ago. And when we were in the tent, I didn't have room for ketchup, mustard, mayo, all those kinds of things, hot sauces. I didn't have room for them in the cooler. So they had to stay out in the coolest space I could find. And none of them ever went bad. Our foods are kind of filled with a lot of salt and sugar. It keeps them pretty preserved. Not only do I have a tote that's full of kind of all the condiments and jellies and peanut butter, but I also have my spice totes, as well as kind of dry goods, rice, some canned totes. And there's kind of several in different places in the coolest, shadiest spots. And I'm always checking, always rotating, and making sure nothing goes bad. But in my experiences so far, I've never had anything go bad, except bread. I did almost forget to mention about root cellars. We definitely want a large root cellar, but I did build a little mini root cellar to help keep our fruits and veggies a little bit fresher for a little bit longer. It's been very helpful in helping to create a little bit more storage space as well as keep my veggies fresher for longer, but it's definitely important to check on it and keep it rotated. And from those totes, I also have buckets. I really like little buckets. Sometimes you can get them at Walmart or certain places that do like frosting, putting flour and sugar in bulk. I like having little buckets of stuff versus having jars of stuff. They're a little breakable, and our ground is stone, and I break things. But as long as something stays dry, out of the direct sun, doesn't get wet, is in the coolest place you can manage, it tends to stay pretty well preserved. Same thing with my eggs. My eggs have never been refrigerated. They've always stayed in a cool, dark area until they get used up. Or over the winter, I do like to water glass my eggs. It's a great way to preserve an abundance of eggs that will feed you eggs through the winter when your ladies start to slow down their egg laying. And of course, getting back to the freezer, having the freezer is great because we can have a harvest, we can vacuum seal that meat or those fruits or those veggies and pack them into the freezer. And that was a huge upgrade for us. It made life so much easier. But with the freezer, sometimes you'll get a bulk of something and you have to rotate stuff out of the freezer. And what do you do with all that stuff that you got to rotate out? There's dehydrating, smoking, pickling, and my favorite is canning. I love to can. But a lot of extra things we kind of randomly get in bulk or get out of the garden, I can them up. I especially love to can up the meats that we harvest. And depending on the meat and what I do with it, those are quick, easy meals. You pop the top, heat it up, and bam, you have some stew or some potatoes or easy apple pie filling. You can can so many things and it creates a variety in your diet. Instead of just apples, you can have spiced apples, applesauce, apple juice. You can have meatloaf, people can hamburger patties. There's so many things that you can can up and put on your shelf for a rainy day when the power goes out or just quick easy meals. And that ties along with dehydrating. It's great to be able to dehydrate your foods, put them in a jar, and set them on the shelf. There are appliances you can get so you can vacuum seal those jars as well to give even a longer shelf life to those dried and dehydrated goods. Many methods of preserving food can seem pretty intimidating at first, but do some reading. Essentially, you got to just experiment, and for me, I've ended up with beautiful, long-lasting foods. Definitely sucks in a way that we are starting all over, and I don't quite have the facility, so to say, to can right now. But once we do start creating abundance and I have a nice space to be able to can, I'll be doing a lot more canning. That jerky experiment was super great because I'm going to dehydrate a lot of meat that way, I think. And I do want to try those types of dehydrating techniques in the winter because the days here still get pretty warm and sunny. But that's an experiment for later. In my opinion, it's really about finding the balance between all of these methods. None are better or worse than the other, but sometimes you have to think about one, like the freezer. What happens if something happens to the freezer? What are you going to do with everything in it? So knowing the other methods of preserving food gives a great advantage to you in keeping your food shelf stable, preserved, or just eatable. It can be a devastating experience when that freezer goes out. So whether it's out of necessity, for fun, or just knowing how to do it, it's wonderful to learn all the techniques to preserve your food as possible, whether it's dehydrating, canning, salting, smoking. They're all fabulous. They're all fun and very interesting to learn, and I highly recommend anyone to give any of them a try. Knowing how to preserve your food in several different ways, whether for necessity, just knowing how to do it when disaster strikes, whether it's for an emergency, easy meals, are all great ways to keep food on the table. And in my experiences, it takes experience to know what food preservation methods work best for you, your wants, and your goals. Happy storing! Peace!